Bosch 95. Hitler stood in his war room laughing at grainy intelligence photos of Soviet tanks. He called them tin cans on tracks, primitive, beneath concern. 3 years later, at Kursk, those same tanks tore through the most elite German armor in a single afternoon, and the laughter died in bunkers from Berlin to the Eastern Front. My grandfather was there, not in a T-34. He was in a Panzer IV, part of the 11th Panzer Division, and he watched the German war machine break against something it never expected to face. Let me take you back to July 1943, the fields of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. The Germans called it Operation Citadel, Hitler's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The plan was simple on paper: encircle the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, destroy them, and regain the initiative lost at Stalingrad. Over 900,000 German troops, nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns, the Tiger, the Panther, the Ferdinand. These were the machines that were supposed to restore German supremacy. My grandfather told me they believed it would work. They had to believe it. After Stalingrad, after the brutal winter retreats, they needed a victory. They needed proof that German engineering, German tactics, German will could still dominate the battlefield. The intelligence briefings mentioned Soviet armor. Of course they did. But the assessments were dismissive. The T-34 had surprised them in 1941. Yes, but German commanders convinced themselves they had adapted. They had better guns now, better armor, better training. The Tiger tank could destroy a T-34 at ranges the Soviet tank couldn't even dream of hitting back. What they didn't understand was that the Soviets had learned too. My grandfather's unit moved into position on July 4th, the night before the assault began. He described the atmosphere as tense but confident. They had practiced the maneuvers. They knew their equipment. The new Panther tanks looked unstoppable. All sloped armor and long-barreled 75mm guns. The Tigers were legends already, feared by every Allied tanker who had encountered them. The morning of July 5th came with artillery. Thousands of guns on both sides opening up simultaneously. The earth didn't shake. It convulsed. My grandfather said you couldn't hear yourself think. You couldn't hear orders being shouted 3 feet away. You felt the concussions in your chest, in your bones, in your teeth. Then they advanced. The German plan called for concentrated armored thrusts to break through Soviet defensive lines. Textbook blitzkrieg. Overwhelming force at specific points. My grandfather's Panzer IV was part of the second wave, positioned to exploit whatever gaps the Tigers and Panthers created. For the first few hours, it seemed to work. They pushed forward. They destroyed Soviet positions. They knocked out T-34s. The Tigers were performing exactly as advertised, killing Soviet tanks at extreme range. My grandfather said the confidence was building. This was what they trained for. This was what German armor did. Then the Soviets committed their reserves. My grandfather described it as a wall of steel appearing on the horizon. Not a company, not a battalion. Entire brigades of T-34s rolling forward in waves that seemed endless. He said the count didn't matter after a certain point. When you see 50 tanks, you count. When you see 200, you just stare. The T-34 wasn't the most sophisticated tank on that battlefield. The Germans were right about that. Its optics were inferior. Its crew comfort was non-existent. Compared to a Tiger, it crude. But it had 3 advantages that Hitler's generals had fatally underestimated. First, the sloped armor. German engineers understood the concept, but the T-34 had been designed around it from the beginning. Shells that should have penetrated instead deflected. Shells that should have killed instead glanced away. My grandfather watched a Panther score what looked like a perfect hit on a T-34 at medium range. The Soviet tank shuddered, slewed sideways, then kept coming. The shell had ricocheted off the front glasses. Second, the wide track. Kursk in July was dry, but the ground was still broken, still scarred by earlier fighting, still unpredictable. German tanks, especially the heavy Tigers and Panthers, started bogging down. Transmissions strained, engines overheated. The T-34s, with their wider tracks and better ground pressure, just kept moving. They went places German armor couldn't follow. Third, and most important, numbers and will. The Soviets didn't fight like the Germans expected. German tank doctrine emphasized precision, careful positioning, mutual support. The T-34s came in mass charges. They accepted losses. They traded tanks the way you'd trade pawns in chess, if it meant getting close enough to use their guns effectively. My grandfather said the afternoon of July 12th changed everything. That was the day of Prokhorovka, the concentrated armor clash on the southern sector of the salient. Over 800 tanks and assault guns colliding in an area of maybe 15 square miles. His unit wasn't at the very center of Prokhorovka, but they were close enough. He described watching waves of T-34s charge German positions in groups of 20, 30, 40 at a time. The Tigers would kill the first rank, sometimes the second. Then the survivors would close the distance, get inside the Tiger's minimum engagement range, and the advantage evaporated. A Tiger tank could kill a T-34 at 2,000 meters, but if a T-34 got within 500 meters, that 76-meter gun was perfectly capable of finding weak points. Side armor, rear armor, the join between turret and hull, and the T-34s were fast. Once they committed to a charge, once they closed that distance, German tankers found themselves in knife fight range with an enemy that had nothing to lose. My grandfather's Panzer IV took a hit at 14:30 hours. He remembered the exact time because he just checked his watch, calculating how much fuel they had left. The shell punched through the right side armor, passed between him and the gunner without hitting either of them, and exited through the left side. The sound, he said, was indescribable. Not an explosion, a crack, like reality splitting open. The driver screamed that the tank was still mobile. They had a hole clean through the fighting compartment, but the engine ran, the tracks moved, and the gun still worked. My grandfather ordered them to reverse, to get out of the immediate engagement zone. As they pulled back, he looked out through the commander's cupola and saw what was left of the Panther company that had been their support. 7 Panthers had started the day. He counted 3 still firing. 1 was burning. 2 were abandoned. Crews fled. The 7th was on its side in a crater. How it got there, he never knew. The T-34s weren't stopping. They weren't consolidating positions. They were still coming forward, engines roaring, guns firing, some of them burning but still advancing until the ammunition cooked off or the crew couldn't take any more. He said that's when he understood. This wasn't about superior equipment. This wasn't about tactical finesse. The Soviets were willing to bleed their tank forces white if it meant stopping the German advance, and they had the numbers to do it. The Schlacht of Kursk lasted until August 23rd, but the outcome was decided in those first 2 weeks. The German offensive broke, not because of a single brilliant Soviet maneuver, not because of a catastrophic mistake. It broke because the T-34s and the men who crewed them simply would not stop coming. Hitler had mocked Soviet armor as primitive. The reality was different. The T-34 was designed for exactly this kind of war: mass production, easy maintenance, good enough performance in the categories that mattered. The Soviets could lose 3 T-34s for every German tank destroyed and still come out ahead, because they could replace those losses and Germany couldn't. My grandfather's Panzer IV made it back to German lines with the crew intact. They were lucky. The division lost over 60% of its armor in 3 weeks. Some units were effectively destroyed. The Tigers and Panthers that survived were pulled back, reorganized, committed to defensive positions. The era of German offensive operations on the Eastern Front was over. He told me about the night after they withdrew from the Kursk salient. His crew sat around their damaged tank, smoking cigarettes, not talking much. The loader finally said what they were all thinking. The Russians could afford to lose and Germany couldn't. That was the war now. Not who had the better tank, who could sustain the losses. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The mythology around German tanks in World War II focuses on the Tiger, the Panther, the technical superiority. But my grandfather said Kursk taught him that wars aren't won by superior engineering alone. They're won by the side that can sustain its will and its resources longer than the enemy can. The T-34 wasn't just a tank, it was a philosophy of warfare. Build something good enough, build enough of them, and crew them with men who understand what they're fighting for. The German tanks were magnificent machines, but they were also expensive, mechanically complex, and slow to produce. Every Tiger lost was a catastrophe. Every T-34 lost was a statistic. After Kursk, my grandfather's unit was committed to defensive operations. They retreated through Ukraine, through Poland, eventually back into Germany itself. He said the T-34s were always there, not always in overwhelming numbers anymore. The Soviets had learned to use them more carefully, more tactically, but they were always there, a constant pressure, a constant reminder that the Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy with deeper reserves, stronger industry, and unbreakable resolve. He survived the war, made it through to May 1945, surrendered to American forces rather than Soviet. He was lucky again. Many of his friends weren't. Some died in their tanks, some died in the retreat, some disappeared into Soviet prisoner camps and never came home. Years later, in the 1970s, he visited a military museum in the United States. They had a T-34 on display, restored, painted, sitting quiet and inert behind a velvet rope. He stood in front of it for 20 minutes, my grandmother told me, just staring. When he finally walked away, all he said was, "That's the tank that beat us. Not the Sherman, not the Churchill, the T-34, the tank Hitler had mocked." There's a tendency to romanticize World War II tank combat, to imagine it as honorable duels between armored knights. My grandfather never saw it that way. He described it as industrial slaughter, machines breaking machines, men burning inside steel coffins, the smell of diesel and cordite and hot metal, and sometimes worse. The T-34 at Kursk wasn't romantic. It was brutal. It was effective. It embodied the Soviet approach to the war. We will pay the cost, whatever the cost is, and we will win, because you cannot sustain the same losses we can. German tankers respected the Tiger. They feared the T-34. Respect comes from admiration of capability. Fear comes from the knowledge that the thing you're facing will keep coming no matter what you do to it. My grandfather told me about a specific T-34 he encountered during the fighting on July 8th. His Panzer IV was in a defensive position, hull down behind a small rise. A T-34 appeared about 900 meters out, moving at an angle. His gunner fired, hit. The T-34 stopped, smoke pouring from the engine deck. They thought it was finished. 30 seconds later, the T-34's turret traversed. Slowly, it fired. The shell went high over my grandfather's tank. The T-34 was immobilized but still fighting. His gunner fired again. Another hit. This time the T-34 started burning. They waited for the crew to bail out. Standard practice. Even in the heat of combat, tankers generally respected each other enough to let crews escape burning vehicles. The hatch opened. One man got out, tried to help a second man out. Then the ammunition exploded and both men vanished in the fireball. My grandfather said that image stuck with him more than almost anything else from the war. Not the massive tank battles. Not the artillery barrages. One T-34, already dead, still fighting. One crew, already beaten, still trying to complete the mission. That was Kursk. That was the Eastern Front. The German soldiers called the T-34 the Devil's Chariot in some units. In others, just the 34, said with the kind of respect you give to something that's tried to kill you and might succeed next time. Soviet tankers had a life expectancy measured in weeks during major operations. They knew it. They climbed into those tanks anyway. Hitler's mockery of Soviet armor came from a fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of war he was fighting. He thought it was about quality over quantity, about superior Aryan engineering defeating Slavic masses. The Soviets understood it was about survival, about destroying the invader regardless of cost. The T-34 was the perfect weapon for that war because it could be produced in massive numbers and was effective enough to kill German tanks when properly employed. By the time Kursk ended, Germany had lost the strategic initiative forever. They would win tactical victories. They would bloody Soviet advances. But they would never again launch a major offensive operation that had any realistic chance of changing the course of the war. The T-34 and the men who crewed it had made sure of that. My grandfather didn't talk about the war much. Most veterans didn't. But when he did, when you got him started, the details came out. The little things. The way the inside of a Panzer IV smelled after 12 hours of operation. The specific sound a tank track made when it was about to throw. The face of the Tiger commander who'd been his friend, seen one morning, gone by evening, tank destroyed with all hands. He said the hardest part wasn't the combat. It was the knowledge, building gradually over months, that they were going to lose. That all the sacrifice, all the skill, all the courage wasn't going to be enough. That the T-34s and the Shermans and the Soviet artillery and the Allied bombers were simply going to grind them down until there was nothing left. Kursk was where that knowledge became undeniable. The mythology of German tank superiority persists today. People still argue about whether a Tiger could beat a Sherman, whether the Panther was the best tank of the war, whether German engineering was superior. My grandfather's answer was simple. It didn't matter. The side with the best tanks lost. The T-34 wasn't the best tank at Kursk by most technical measures, but it was the right tank. It could be produced in the numbers needed. It could handle the terrain. It could be crewed by hastily trained replacements and still be effective. It could absorb losses that would have crippled a force built around Tigers and Panthers. Hitler mocked it. His generals underestimated it. The men in the trenches and the tanks learned to fear it. My grandfather's Panzer IV was eventually destroyed in Poland in early 1985. Engine failure, then an artillery strike while the crew was trying to repair it. They abandoned the vehicle and continued the retreat on foot. He made it to the Elbe River, crossed to American lines, and spent 2 years in a POW camp before being repatriated. He brought home a piece of metal he'd kept in his pocket, a chunk of armor plate from a destroyed T-34, picked up during the retreat from Kursk, jagged, scorched, about the size of a playing card. He kept it in a drawer in his study, never displayed it, never threw it away, just kept it. After he died, I found it among his things. There's no inscription, no explanation, just a piece of Soviet armor that once tried to kill him, a reminder of the tank that broke the German army at Kursk, a reminder that wars are won by the side that can endure, not just the side with the best equipment. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The veterans of Kursk on both sides are almost all gone now. The men who climbed into T-34s knowing they might not survive the day. The men who crewed Tigers and Panthers and Panzer IVs and watched the tide turn against them. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as propaganda for either side, but as testimony to the brutal reality of industrial warfare. Hitler's mockery of Soviet armor was the arrogance of a man who believed ideology trumped material reality. The T-34 at Kursk was the answer, crude by some standards, unstoppable by the standards that mattered. It couldn't always penetrate German armor at long range. It didn't need to. It could get close, it could flank, it could overwhelm, and there were always more of them. My grandfather used to say the war was lost the moment Germany invaded the Soviet Union, not because of the winter, not because of the mud, because the Soviets had the space to retreat, the population to sustain losses, and the industrial capacity to produce weapons like the T-34 faster than Germany could destroy them. Kursk just made it obvious. The last time I spoke with him about the war, a few months before he passed, he was in his 90s. His memory was fading in some areas, sharp as ever in others. I asked him what he remembered most about Kursk. He thought for a long time. Then he said, the sound of the T-34 engines. Dozens of them, like thunder that never stopped. We knew what it meant, we knew what was coming, and we couldn't stop it. That's the story of Kursk. Not a single heroic action, not a brilliant tactical maneuver, just the sound of engines, the inevitability of Soviet armor rolling forward, the knowledge that the side with deeper reserves and stronger will would prevail, regardless of who had the better tank. Hitler mocked Soviet armor. The T-34s broke German lines in one afternoon, and the laughter died, replaced by the thunder of diesel engines and the crack of 76mm guns. The men who were there never forgot that sound. We shouldn't either. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. After July 1943, the Wehrmacht was in retreat, fighting delaying actions, trying desperately to slow the Soviet advance. The T-34 became the symbol of that advance, not invincible. The Germans destroyed thousands of them, but unstoppable in the aggregate. Always more, always pressing forward. My grandfather's war ended with surrender. The T-34's war ended in Berlin. Soviet tanks rolling through the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. The tank Hitler had mocked ended the war he started. There's a lesson there, not about tanks specifically, about the danger of underestimating an enemy, about the folly of believing your own propaganda, about the reality that material capacity and national will matter more than technical superiority. The T-34 wasn't sophisticated, it was sufficient, and sufficiency, produced in massive quantities and employed with determination, beat excellence every time. My grandfather would want these stories told accurately, not to glorify war, not to celebrate either side, but to record what happened, to honor the men who fought, regardless of which flag they served, to remember that war is waste and horror and loss, even when it's necessary, even when one side is clearly in the right. The T-34s at Kursk were crewed by Soviet soldiers fighting to liberate their homeland from an invader who had come to enslave and exterminate. The German tanks were crewed by men who, whatever they believed individually, were serving a regime of unspeakable evil. The moral calculation is not complex, but the men in the tanks, on both sides, were still men. They bled, they burned, they feared, they fought, and most of them died, or watched their friends die, in a battle that decided the fate of nations. Hitler mocked Soviet armor from the safety of his headquarters, surrounded by yes-men and maps that didn't reflect reality. The men at Kursk had no such illusions. They saw the T-34s coming, they fought them, and they learned, too late for Germany, that mockery is no substitute for respect. That respect is what my grandfather carried home, not admiration for the Soviet system, not sympathy for their cause, though he understood by war's end what the Wehrmacht had done in the East. Just simple professional respect for the T-34 and the men who crewed it. They were the enemy. They were effective. They won. The piece of armor plate in his drawer was his way of remembering that. The tank that beat us. The weapon we underestimated. The symbol of our defeat. These stories matter because they're true, because they happen to real people, because the generation that lived them is gone. And if we don't preserve their testimony, it vanishes forever. My grandfather was part of the German war machine. He followed orders. He fought for a cause that history rightly condemned. But he was also a young man who believed what he was told, who did what he thought was his duty, and who lived with the consequences for the rest of his life. His story is part of the larger story of Kursk, and Kursk is part of the larger story of how the T-34 broke the German army. Hitler's mockery echoes through history as a cautionary tale. The T-34 rolling through Prokhorovka is the answer. Not words, action, not propaganda. Steel and fire and blood, the reality that smashed the illusion. The veterans are gone. The tanks remain in museums and memorials. The stories survive in families, in archives, in testimonies like this. We owe it to the men who were there to get the stories right, to honor their service without glorifying the waste, to remember Kursk not as triumph or tragedy alone, but as both, as history. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The T-34 at Kursk changed the course of World War II. Not alone, not without the sacrifice of millions, but changed it nonetheless. Hitler's mockery turned to ash. The German lines broke, and the war moved west, toward its inevitable conclusion. My grandfather's testimony is one voice among millions, but it's a voice that was there, that saw the T-34s come over the ridge, that felt the ground shake under their tracks, that understood in that moment the war was lost. These are the stories that must be preserved. Not sanitized, not politicized, just told as honestly as we can while we still have the chance. The sound of T-34 engines, the crack of 76mm guns, the knowledge that they would keep coming no matter the cost. That's Kursk. That's the Eastern Front. That's the war Hitler started and the T-34 helped end. We remember. We must remember. For the men who fought, for the truth of what happened, for the lessons that history, if we let it, still has to teach. The war didn't end at Kursk. It just changed direction. My grandfather said the difference was palpable. Before July 1943, even during retreats, even after Stalingrad, there were still conversations about counteroffensives, about recovering lost ground, about turning the tide. After Kursk, those conversations stopped. The talk became about holding lines, about delaying the inevitable, about survival. The T-34 became a constant presence in that long retreat, not always in massive formations like Prokhorovka. The Soviets had learned from their early war losses. They started using their armor more carefully, with better infantry support, with better coordination. But the T-34s were always there, probing German positions, exploiting weaknesses, pushing westward. My grandfather's unit was reorganized 3 times between Kursk and the end of 1943. Each time, there were fewer experienced crews, more replacements. Younger men, boys really, 16, 17 years old, told they were the future of Germany. Given 2 weeks of training and put in command of tanks they barely understood. He said watching those young crews was harder than the combat itself. They made mistakes that veterans wouldn't make. They panicked under fire. They died in ways that experience might have prevented. And there was nothing he could do except try to keep his own crew alive and hope the boys learned fast enough to survive. The T-34s didn't discriminate. Veteran or replacement, the 76mm gun killed just the same. By late 1943, the Soviets were fielding the T-34-85, an upgraded version with an 85mm gun that could penetrate even Tiger armor at reasonable range. The technical gap that Germany had relied on was closing. The numerical gap was widening. My grandfather described a battle near Kiev in November 1943. His Panzer IV was part of a defensive position on a ridgeline. They had a good field of fire, clear sight lines for over a kilometer. They knocked out 6 T-34s in the first hour of the Soviet attack. 6 confirmed kills. His gunner was excellent, one of the best in the division. It didn't matter. For every T-34 they destroyed, 3 more appeared. The Soviet attack didn't waver, didn't hesitate. They kept coming. By mid-afternoon, German forces were abandoning the position, falling back to the next defensive line. My grandfather's tank was one of the last to withdraw. As they pulled back, he looked over the battlefield and counted 17 burning T-34s. Soviet victory flags were already being raised on the ridge his unit had just abandoned. 17 T-34s destroyed in one small sector. A tactical success by any reasonable measure. A strategic defeat because the Soviets could afford those losses and Germany couldn't afford to keep retreating. That was the pattern through the winter of 1943 into 1944. German units would establish defensive positions. Soviet forces would attack with combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, air support. The Germans would inflict disproportionate casualties. Then they would retreat because holding was impossible. The T-34s would occupy the ground and the cycle would repeat. Always further west. My grandfather said the retreat through Ukraine was the worst period of the war for him. Not the most dangerous, necessarily, but the most demoralizing. They were giving up territory Germany had paid for in blood to capture. They were abandoning Soviet civilians who had collaborated with German forces leaving them to face Soviet retribution. They were watching the Wehrmacht disintegrate, one retreat at a time. The T-34 was the symbol of that disintegration. Every time they saw Soviet armor on the horizon, they knew what it meant. Another battle, another retreat, another step closer to Germany itself. He told me about a moment in January 1944, near Zhytomyr. His crew was bivouacked in a destroyed village, trying to get some rest before the next engagement. It was brutally cold, the kind of cold that makes steel brittle and oil thick, and men question whether they'll survive the night even without enemy action. A Tiger tank from another unit was positioned nearby. The crew had built a fire, were huddled around it. My grandfather walked over, hoping to share the warmth. The Tiger commander was maybe 22 years old. An officer, well-educated. He was staring into the fire, not speaking. My grandfather asked him what he was thinking about. The Tiger commander said, "I'm thinking about how many T-34s my tank has killed. I counted once. 47 confirmed. Probably more that we couldn't confirm. 47 Soviet tanks destroyed by this one Tiger." He paused, then continued, "And it doesn't matter. There are always more. We kill them, and they keep coming. What's the point of being the best if the best isn't enough?" 2 days later, the Tiger was destroyed by Soviet infantry with satchel charges. The crew got out, but the tank was gone. 47 T-34 kills meant nothing when Soviet tactics evolved to neutralize the Tiger's advantages. That was the psychological war the T-34 waged, not just destroying German tanks, destroying German morale, making it clear that technical superiority was meaningless against an enemy with unlimited reserves and unbreakable will. By spring 1944, my grandfather's division was pulled back into Poland. They were supposed to be reorganizing, refitting, preparing for defensive operations. In reality, they were trying to patch together a functional fighting force from the remnants of units that had been destroyed on the Eastern Front. He said the new equipment they received was a mix of the sublime and the ridiculous. A few late-model Panthers, beautiful machines when they worked, obsolete Panzer IIIs that should have been retired years earlier, even some captured Soviet equipment, including 2 T-34s that had been repaired and pressed into German service. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The tank that had broken them at Kursk was now fighting for Germany because they didn't have enough of their own armor left. My grandfather said those captured T-34s were more reliable than half the German tanks in the unit. They broke down less. They were easier to repair. They proved, even in German hands, why they were effective. The summer of 1944 brought Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that destroyed Army Group Center. My grandfather's unit was south of the main assault, but they felt the shockwaves. Entire German armies ceased to exist. Hundreds of thousands of men killed or captured. The Eastern Front collapsed. The T-34s were everywhere during Bagration, not just as tanks, but as symbols. Soviet propaganda films showed them rolling through liberated cities. Photographs of T-34s with infantry riding on top became iconic images of Soviet victory. The tank Hitler had mocked was now the face of Germany's defeat. My grandfather's unit fought delaying actions through Poland and into East Prussia. By autumn 1944, they were fighting on German soil. The psychological impact was profound. These were German villages being destroyed, German civilians fleeing westward. The war had come home, and the T-34s were bringing it. He described a battle in October 1944 near the town of Gumbinnen. Soviet forces had broken through German lines and were threatening to encircle several divisions. My grandfather's Panzer IV was part of a counterattack meant to seal the breach. They advanced through heavy fog, visibility maybe 50 meters. They stumbled into a column of T-34s moving perpendicular to their line of advance. Point-blank range. Both sides were surprised. The next 90 seconds were chaos. His gunner destroyed the lead T-34. The second T-34 fired, missed. The third T-34 scored a glancing hit that damaged their track. His gunner killed the second T-34. The third one was so close they could hear its engine roaring. The loader screamed that they were out of armor-piercing rounds, only high explosive left. The gunner fired anyway, hitting the T-34's turret. The HE round didn't penetrate, but the explosion startled the Soviet crew. They backed away, disappearing into the fog. My grandfather's tank limped back to German lines with a damaged track and the knowledge that they'd survived by pure luck. If that third T-34 had pressed the attack, if its crew had realized the German tank was crippled, the engagement would have ended differently. That's what the war had become by late 1944. Not grand tactical maneuvers, not decisive battles, just brutal, confused engagements where survival was random and death was arbitrary. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The winter of 1944-45 was the coldest my grandfather remembered. Not meteorologically, spiritually, The war was lost, everyone knew it, but it continued. Men kept dying for territory that would be abandoned within days or weeks. The T-34s kept coming, joined now by American Shermans and British Churchills from the West, squeezing Germany in a vice that was tightening every day. My grandfather said the hardest part was watching the very young and the very old being thrown into combat. By early 1945, Germany was conscripting boys from the Hitler Youth and men in their 50s. They were given uniforms and rifles and told to stop the Soviet advance. The T-34s rolled over them like they weren't there. He witnessed an incident in February 1945 that he said haunted him until his death. A company of Hitler Youth, maybe 15 or 16 years old, had been given Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and told to hold a village against Soviet armor. My grandfather's unit was retreating through that village when the Soviet attack came. The boys tried. They were brave, foolish and brave. They fired their Panzerfausts at the T-34s, destroyed 2 of them. Then the Soviet infantry arrived, supported by more tanks, and it was over in minutes. My grandfather said his unit couldn't stay to help. They barely made it through themselves, but he heard the gunfire behind them and knew what it meant. Those boys died fighting T-34s because Hitler and his generals refused to surrender, refused to admit defeat, kept feeding Germany's youth into a war that was already decided. The T-34 didn't choose to kill those boys, but it did. That's war. The weapon doesn't decide. The men who wield it don't always decide. The politicians who started it decided years earlier, and everyone else just lived or died with the consequences. By March 1945, my grandfather's unit was in western Poland, retreating toward the Oder River. They had maybe a dozen functional tanks left from a division that had started the war with over 200. Spare parts were non-existent. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was scarce. They were a fighting force in name only. The T-34s facing them were battle-hardened, well-supplied, and supported by overwhelming firepower. The Soviets had air superiority. They had artillery superiority. They had numerical superiority in every category. German forces were fighting with courage and desperation and nothing else. My grandfather's Panzer IV finally died near Kustrin, not from enemy fire. The transmission gave out, just seized up after years of hard use and insufficient maintenance. They tried to repair it, worked through the night, but the parts they needed didn't exist anymore. At dawn, they stripped the tank of everything useful, set demolition charges, and continued on foot. He said walking away from that tank was like leaving a friend behind. That Panzer IV had kept him alive through Kursk, through Ukraine, through Poland. It had taken hits and kept fighting. And now, it was gone, destroyed by its own crew to prevent capture, because Germany didn't have the resources to keep it running. The crew made it to the Oder, crossed on a pontoon bridge under Soviet artillery fire, and joined the remnants of other units forming a defensive line. By then, it was April 1945. Berlin was under siege. The war had maybe a month left, but men were still dying, and the T-34s were still coming. My grandfather said the final weeks were surreal. Everyone knew the war was ending. Radio broadcasts still spoke of miracle weapons and final victory, but nobody believed it anymore. The goal became simple: survive until the end, and try to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Soviets. His group, what was left of his tank crew and other stragglers, moved west. They avoided major roads where Soviet armor operated. They hid during the day and moved at night. They scrounged food from abandoned farms. They ditched their weapons, kept their identification, and hoped they'd make it to the Elbe. They saw T-34s in the distance several times during that final journey. Just glimpses. Soviet patrols, columns moving toward Berlin. By then, the T-34 wasn't hunting German soldiers. It was occupying a defeated nation. The war was over in all but name. My grandfather's group reached the Elbe River on May 3, 1945. They could see American positions on the far bank. They waited until dawn, then waded across with their hands up, surrendering to American troops who processed them with bureaucratic efficiency and sent them to a POW camp in Bavaria. 5 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The T-34s stopped rolling west. The killing stopped, at least in that theater, at least for those men. My grandfather spent 2 years in that POW camp. The Americans treated them reasonably well, fed them, didn't abuse them, processed them slowly through denazification proceedings, and then eventually released them to go home, if they still had homes to go to. He did. His family had survived. His house was still standing. He was lucky. Millions weren't. The war had consumed an entire generation, destroyed whole nations, revealed depths of human evil that still defy comprehension. And through it all, from Kursk in July 1943 to Berlin in May 1945, the T-34 had been there, not the only weapon that defeated Germany, Not even always the most important weapon in specific engagements, but present, constant, a symbol of Soviet power and German defeat. Hitler had mocked those tanks, called them primitive, beneath concern. The men who fought them learned differently. The men who died facing them learned the hardest lesson of all. That mockery is meaningless against steel and fire and determination. My grandfather kept that piece of T-34 armor plate his entire life. Never explained it to most people. Never displayed it, but kept it in a drawer where he could see it when he opened that drawer. A reminder, a memorial, a testament to the tank that beat them. The T-34 wasn't invincible. German forces destroyed thousands of them, but it was sufficient. It was available in numbers that Germany couldn't match. It was crewed by men fighting for their homeland against an invader who had come to destroy them. And ultimately, that was enough. The generation that fought at Kursk is gone now. My grandfather died in 1994, almost exactly 50 years after the fighting that defined his youth. The men who crewed T-34s, who charged German lines knowing the odds, who paid the price for victory, they're gone too. The last veterans are in their hundreds now. Memories fading, time running out. These stories survive only in testimony, in archives, in families like mine who preserved them. The T-34 survives in museums, a relic of a war most people know only from history books. But for the men who were there, it was more than a relic. It was the instrument of their defeat or their salvation, depending on which side they fought for. My grandfather never forgave the Nazi regime for what it did. Never forgave Hitler for starting a war that destroyed Germany and consumed millions of lives. He didn't talk about the war as a glorious adventure. He talked about it as waste, as horror, as something that should never happen again. But he respected the T-34 and the men who crewed it. He understood that they were soldiers, like him, that they fought for what they believed was right, that they were brave, whether he agreed with their cause or not. War makes enemies of men who might have been friends in different circumstances. The T-34 at Kursk broke the German lines in one afternoon, but it also broke something deeper, the illusion that Germany could win through superior weapons and tactics alone. The reality was harsher. The side with greater resources, stronger will, and juster cause would prevail. The T-34 was the instrument of that reality. Hitler's mockery was revealed as the delusion it always was. These memories matter because they're true, because they happened, because forgetting them means risking repeating them. My grandfather wanted his story told not to glorify his service or excuse his nation's crimes, but to bear witness to what war actually is when the propaganda is stripped away. It's men in tanks, killing other men in tanks, for reasons decided by politicians who never face the consequences of their decisions. It's T-34s rolling across battlefields strewn with the dead. It's victory purchased at a price so high that calling it victory feels obscene. It's defeat so total that rebuilding takes generations. Hitler mocked Soviet armor. The T-34s had the last word, not in speeches or propaganda, in action, in battle, in the grinding, bloody, inevitable advance from Kursk to Berlin. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what we must remember.